The Rain Man. Working the night shift at a convenience store always had its odd moments. The store was isolated, perched on the edge of a nearly deserted road, and the nights were quiet, with few customers. Only the cold, steady glow of the neon lights lit up the place, casting long shadows along the walls. On rainy nights, the station felt even lonelier, and the sound of raindrops was often my only company. That night, as I updated the inventory system, the clock read 3 a.m. outside, the rain poured down hard, and the wind picked up, rattling the glass doors of the station. Then the doorbell chimed. I looked up to see a man entering. He wore a heavy, soaked coat, with a hat obscuring most of his face. There was something off about him. He moved without making a sound, without the wet squish of footsteps. I took a deep breath and tried to greet him, but he only walked to the back of the store without a word, without even lifting his head. I watched him carefully. He didn't pick up anything from the shelves. He only looked at the products, tilting his head in an odd way, as if he was trying to see something beyond them. His coat dripped water, leaving a trail on the floor that spread in strange patterns. Finally, he approached the counter, stopping a few feet away from me, still without lifting his face. My discomfort grew by the second. I tried to break the silence. "Can I help you with anything?" I asked, attempting a casual tone. He murmured something, but his voice was so low I couldn't make it out. I leaned in, trying to hear him better, and then he looked up. Our eyes met, and a chill shot through me. His eyes, they weren't normal. They held no emotion, yet they reflected the light in a strange way, as if they had a cold, unnatural glow. Fear grew inside me as he spoke, his voice distant, as if coming from far away. "I am here because they asked me to be." Each word echoed like a ghostly whisper. I tried to reply, but my throat seemed frozen. Before I could react, he turned and walked out, vanishing into the darkness and rain as if he had been absorbed by the storm. Still processing what had just happened, I looked down at the floor. The wet footprints he left weren't ordinary. The pattern seemed directed, leading straight to the counter. I walked closer and noticed a wet handprint on the glass where he'd touched it. But something was wrong. The fingers looked too thin, not quite human. The next day, still shaken, I decided to review the security footage. Maybe the video would explain what I had seen. And what I found in the recording was even worse. On the screen, the man appeared as a shadowy figure, almost shrouded in mist. His outline was blurred, his image distorted, as if the camera couldn't capture his true form. At one point, he seemed to look directly at the camera, but his face was smeared, a disturbing blur. When he stopped in front of the counter, there was a chilling moment. He seemed to smile, a faint, slight pull at his lips, but it conveyed something deeply unsettling. It was as if he wanted to leave a message, something I would never forget. And then, just like in reality, he disappeared through the door. Since that night, I haven't seen the Rain Man again. But every time a storm rolls in and the raindrops beat against the windows, I look toward the door, half expecting the bell to chime and for him to walk in again. The silence, the emptiness in his gaze still haunt me. Now I know that some presences don't belong to this world, and I understand that some wait patiently to return. The customer without a reflection. Working the graveyard shift at a lonely diner always had its moments of boredom. The neighborhood was deserted at that hour, and the silence seemed to seep into every corner, filling even the smallest spaces. The only thing breaking that stillness was the large mirror along the diner's wall, reflecting the whole room and giving me a complete view of everything, or almost everything around me. The night dragged on slowly, and I passed the time by restocking shelves or cleaning up the counters. Sometimes, the faint hum of the lights broke the silence, but that night, as the clock neared 2 a.m., nothing seemed to happen. Then out of nowhere, the doorbell chimed. I looked up to see a tall, peculiar man enter. He wore a long, dark coat of an older style and a hat that shadowed most of his face, concealing his features. He made no sound as he walked in. He just glided to a booth near the mirror and sat down, keeping his gaze fixed on the glass. I approached him, greeting him with a good evening, but he didn't turn his head. His presence filled the room with an unsettling silence. Something about him disturbed me, something I couldn't quite identify. As I got closer to where he sat, I noticed it. His reflection was missing from the mirror. Everything around him was perfectly clear, the tables, the counter, even my own reflection. But the man, sitting only a few feet away, simply wasn't there. The initial shock quickly turned into an uncomfortable curiosity. Maybe it was a trick of the light or some strange optical effect. I tried to disguise my unease and asked if he wanted anything. He murmured something almost inaudible, but I couldn't make out the words. I moved a bit closer, trying to understand what he said. "Did you say something, sir?" Suddenly, he raised his face and looked right at me. The diner's light revealed his pale skin and his vacant eyes, which held no emotion whatsoever. What I saw in them, however, was a disturbing mix of apathy and something else. A faint smile played on his lips as he spoke in a low, slow voice. "I didn't come for food. I just want to watch." His words hit me harder than I expected. I took a step back instinctively, unsure of how to respond. He kept staring at me with that unsettling smile, as if he knew more than I could guess. I managed to pull myself away and retreated to the counter, trying to find something to keep me busy. But the feeling of discomfort only grew. It was as if the whole atmosphere had shifted, becoming colder. From the counter, I kept glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. He didn't move, just continued staring into the mirror as though he was captivated by it. Then a low, strange sound began to fill the diner. It sounded like scratching coming from the mirror, as if something on the other side was trying to break through. I looked at the man again, but he was still motionless. Then the sound stopped abruptly. Silence returned, but the tension was suffocating. I leaned in closer to the mirror, searching for any sign of what might be happening. But all I saw was my own reflection, and, for just a second, something beside me. A shadow, something that wasn't there when I turned around. I blinked in shock, and it was gone. The strange customer watched me, his stare more intense now, as if he noticed that I was aware of something. Without a word, he tilted his head and murmured, "You shouldn't look too closely." His words sounded like a warning, but there was also a hint of amusement, as if he were testing my courage. Not sure what to do, I returned to the counter, trying to ignore him and that enigmatic smile, but my mind was buzzing with what I'd seen in the mirror. The night, once so calm, now felt as if something was drawing closer, watching me every second. I glanced back at the booth, but this time he was gone. The chair sat empty, slightly pulled back, but he was nowhere to be seen. I hadn't heard the doorbell, nor the sound of footsteps. Just emptiness. Approaching the mirror, I noticed something odd. There was a dark, distorted handprint smeared on the glass, where he'd been staring. The fingers were too long, too thin, and left a stain that wouldn't come off, no matter how hard I rubbed. I returned to the counter, trying to make sense of what had just happened. In the following days, each time I looked at the mirror, I felt a growing unease. It was as if something had stayed behind, waiting, maybe even watching me. That cold smile of his still lingered in my mind, and I knew he wasn't just an ordinary customer. He had brought something deeply wrong into the diner, a piece of darkness that refused to leave. Since that night, the mirror on the wall has never felt the same. And sometimes, while working alone, I still hear that faint sound, almost imperceptible, like something scratching the surface, trying to break through. The woman in the hallway. Working the graveyard shift in an isolated convenience store is not for the faint-hearted, and I always thought I was strong enough to handle the quiet and solitude. The store sat alone, and the empty street made the place feel even eerier. Neon lights bathed the store's interior in a cold glow, casting long shadows across the aisles. The hours dragged, and I did my best to keep my mind occupied. Around 2 in the morning, I felt the chill of the night creeping in through the cracks around the door, and the bell chimed. I looked up and saw a woman standing in the entrance, completely still. She looked like she belonged to another time, wearing an old-fashioned dress with a dark, worn shawl draped over her shoulders. Her face was pale, her hair hanging in messy strands. She started to walk through the store, moving slowly, her gaze unfocused, like she was floating through the aisles without really looking at anything. I watched her while pretending to tidy up the shelves, hoping not to be too obvious. Every time I glanced away, she would appear at the end of a different aisle, just standing there, staring at me. Her expression was blank, but her gaze held a weight that made me feel as though something dark was closing in around me. My unease turned to fear, and I couldn't ignore her presence any longer. I gathered the last bit of courage I had and approached her, attempting a polite smile, though my voice barely came out as a whisper. "Can I help you with something?" She didn't answer right away, only turning her head slowly, as if her movements were too slow for this world. Then, without warning, she spoke words that made my blood run cold. "They're coming for you?" Her words hung in the air like a silent threat, and I felt my whole body freeze. Her voice was strange, as though it came from some distant place, filled with an urgency I couldn't understand. Before I could react, she turned and walked out of the store. I stood there, stunned, listening to the doorbell chime as the silence returned. But, somehow, I felt I was no longer alone. The air felt heavier, denser, as though something had been left behind. I needed to make sense of what had happened. I rushed to the security room to review the footage, hoping to convince myself she was just a strange woman. But when I looked at the screen, she didn't appear fully human. Her image was like a shadow, moving in unnatural ways. With each step, her face seemed to stretch, bending at impossible angles, her eyes transforming into dark, empty voids, as though she was a reflection of something that didn't belong in this world. Whenever she looked directly at the camera, the video distorted, like the space around her couldn't bear her presence. And then, in an instant, she vanished from the footage. I waited for her to reappear, but the camera showed only the empty hallway, with no sign she had ever been there. I returned to the counter, trying to get back to the routine, but every shadow, every sound, now felt heavier with the memory of that encounter. Her words, "They're coming for you," played over and over in my head. The store felt different, like I was being watched, like there was a hidden presence between the aisles, following my every move. Since that night, I've never felt alone in the store. Every time the doorbell rings, a chill runs down my spine, as though I'm expecting to see her again, standing in the entrance with that unexplainable look. Sometimes, when I glance at the reflections in the windows, I think I see her shadow, a faint figure lingering at the end of the aisle, watching me from afar, waiting. Now, every night feels like a countdown, like whatever she was warning me about is drawing closer, getting nearer with each passing hour. The midnight customer. Working the graveyard shift in a 24-hour pharmacy was usually peaceful, almost too peaceful. At night, the city felt deserted, and the heavy silence, broken only by the distant sound of occasional cars, made the pharmacy feel even more isolated. I liked the calm of it. One of those nights, around 3 in the morning, the automatic door opened. I was restocking some medicine on the shelves when the sound of the door made me turn. A man walked in, but there was something about him that made me stop in my tracks. He was dressed too lightly for the cold at that hour, wearing only a thin, wrinkled shirt faded with age, and a worn pair of jeans. He was tall and extremely thin, and his movements were strange, slow, almost dragging. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes sunken and fixed on the floor, as though he hadn't slept in weeks, while he made his way toward the counter. Feeling an unease growing inside me, I cautiously greeted him with a good evening. He stopped, raised his head almost mechanically, and looked me in the eyes. His lips twisted into a forced smile, but there was something deeply unsettling in his gaze, like he was looking through me or seeing something only he could. Then, in a raspy, almost lifeless tone, he muttered, "I'm sorry for what you're about to face." His words echoed inside me like a warning from some dark place. For a moment, I was speechless, as if he'd spoken a sentence I couldn't fully comprehend, but somehow felt was condemning me. Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and left through the door, disappearing into the empty, dark street. Silence filled the space again, but something inside me knew that encounter had left a deep mark. Still trying to process what had happened, I noticed the pharmacy felt different. The lights began to flicker slightly, and an inexplicable chill filled the air. The silence, once comforting, grew heavier and oppressive. Every small sound seemed amplified, like I was being watched from somewhere unseen. I thought of checking the security cameras to make sure the man had actually been there and that my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. But when I reached the monitoring room, I saw that the cameras were off. Odd, considering I'd checked the system earlier that night, and everything was working fine. I tried to turn them back on, but the screen only displayed a black void with no signal. Returning to the counter, an uneasy feeling weighed on me, as if the air itself was thickening, trapping me. Then I noticed something strange. The shelves began to tremble slightly, and some products fell as if an unseen force had knocked them off. Each little bottle or box that hit the floor felt like a sign, a warning that something was indeed there, watching. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I spun around, but the aisle was empty. My breath quickened, and a deep fear gripped me. Absolute silence returned, but I felt a presence observing me from some corner of the pharmacy, something I couldn't see, but could clearly sense. With each passing minute, the air felt heavier, as though something was drawing closer, closing in. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the man and his warning. "I'm sorry for what you're about to face." Those words began to reverberate in my mind like a curse, a prophecy telling me that something was indeed coming. It was a warning, something beyond human comprehension. As the days went by, the feeling of being watched never left. Every night, at the same hour, I sensed that cold, inexplicable presence lurking in the pharmacy. There was an eerie energy in the air, a tension that suffocated me. But there was no logical explanation for what was happening. I began to sleep poorly, waking up in the dead of night to the sound of footsteps and whispers, as if someone was standing right by my bed. One night, as I prepared to briefly close the pharmacy to restock the shelves, I heard the sound of something scratching at the back door. A low but persistent noise, like fingernails scraping against metal. I opened the door slowly, but no one was there. The sound, however, continued, now coming from inside the store, echoing down the aisles like a whisper that wouldn't stop. Desperation and fear began to consume me. I tried to leave, but I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, pulling me back, holding me in place. My vision began to darken, and I heard the man's voice echo through the pharmacy. Though he was nowhere to be seen, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what's coming." If you love mysteries and the supernatural, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Leave a like to support the work and share with friends who are into the supernatural. Your engagement keeps these secrets alive.